We've talked today in this our conversation about advocacy. Brandy, I think you said do was the third piece of the covert plan that you laid out so well for us, and that advocacy was core to that. We've also talked about this unique opportunity that we have where policymakers are paying attention to the needs of entrepreneurs and small business owners, and that advocacy really matters now. And while public policy can be messy at times and change can take sometimes years to achieve, we know that one change that reduces a barrier for entrepreneurship can positively impact hundreds, thousands, millions of entrepreneurs, depending on what level of government that change occurs. And so our approach is really focused on advocacy, empowering entrepreneurs and people who work with entrepreneurs to engage in policy conversations so that policymakers know what needs entrepreneurs have, that they're hearing directly from entrepreneurs. Because I think in the absence of that, we will continue to get policies that advantage big over small, old over new. And we have an opportunity now to, I think, create an economy that is different than the economy we left behind pre-COVID in February. But that takes engagement from folks. So for your organizations, for the Rural Center in North Carolina, for Institute for Local Self-Reliance, what are some of the key policies that your organizations are advocating for when it comes to entrepreneurship? What are the things that you want to see changed?
We're definitely hearing from our small business owners and parents and students is this issue around broadband, right? Broadband accessibility, affordability, and adoption is really impacting the bottom line of our small business owners. We know that our small businesses rely heavily on access to high quality, dependable broadband, AKA high-speed internet, right? It allows them to market and sell their products and generally just to thrive. And so what the needs are for broadband access for us is a huge issue that we've been advocating for, one that we see impacts a number of communities and a number of sectors, and particularly small businesses are one of those definitely that we are watching very heavily. I'll definitely say the other is around health insurance, right? So in North Carolina, one of our major policy issues and opportunities, I will say, is to close the health insurance coverage gap. North Carolina right now remains one of 13 states that have not expanded Medicaid. And, with this pandemic, as Stacy, mentioned earlier, around not just the health implications, that we are seeing that people are obviously losing their jobs, right? No matter how big or how small the business. And so as a result of that, we're steadily seeing more people without health insurance. We're actually not even sure of the exact number. And so with that, we know that's going to have a huge economic impact across North Carolina. We can only imagine who those individuals are, but the likelihood is a really strong and high percentage of those folks who are impacted are particularly entrepreneurs and small business owners and their employees, right? So on a federal level, we're aiming for reauthorization of the state small business credit initiative. We see a significant infusion in that program, being able to provide some immediate access to capital for our small businesses that desperately need it, especially now during this pandemic. And North Carolina has a fabulous program, one that has significant success. And, we just think a small infusion and reauthorization of that will keep that going and is another way to support our small businesses across the state.
Mm-hmm. Stacy, what about ILSR?
We work on both the local and the national level because we really see needs in both of those arenas. At the local level, we do a lot of work where we sort of function as a kind of hub of innovative policy ideas, and the report that we've just published around how communities can address the crisis facing small businesses during COVID, is a good example of that because it kind of compiles a bunch of different ideas that we've seen in different parts of the country that seem to be effective and then disseminates them broadly. We think there are a lot of tools at the local level and a lot of dormant, untapped power that cities and states have to shift the dynamic so that it's more possible to start businesses. We also do a lot of work at the local level on the broadband issue. To pick up on Brandy's point, we've helped hundreds of communities start publicly owned or community owned broadband networks, including Wilson, North Carolina, which has really seen like this incredible economic activity, as I understand it, as a result of having high speed broadband. At the same time, I feel in the research that I've done over the years about independent businesses, I'm just very struck at these bigger problems around, for example, the fact that we don't police issues of market power, that our antitrust laws have become so relaxed that we see companies, big companies, sort of routinely able to take advantage of their size to exclude smaller companies from having access to the market. I mean, just to take one example, is in the craft beer scene. Small scale brewing is, in some respects, this great success story in entrepreneurship. We've seen this explosion of small scale craft brewing all across the country. And yet what is happening is that you can start a very small brewery, but if you try to grow above a certain size, in many states you run into the power of Anheuser-Busch and Miller Coors that control the distribution networks. And so if you want to be a microbrewer, it's okay, but if you want to get a little bit bigger and distribute in supermarkets, for example, you can run headlong into their ability to block you because they own the distribution. So there's some structural issues like that we have begun to really spend focusing on Congress and the federal antitrust agencies to address those problems so that we can really free things up for more businesses to be successful.
I love that, and hearing what both of your organizations are doing on the policy front. We've touched on all three levels of government, federal, state, and local. And I think that's important sometimes, that we can tend, I think, because of just how much oxygen gets taken up by conversation and the news media, et cetera, around what happens in DC, to think that that's the place you got to go, right, if you want to see change. But we know that things that happen at the local level, at the state level, that also matters a great deal to entrepreneurship. And if we want to create a more level playing field, a better ecosystem for entrepreneurship, we need all three levels of government to really step up their level of support, to listen to the needs of entrepreneurs and those who work with them, to begin reducing the barriers that stand in entrepreneurs' way. Before we wrap up, I want to try and just to do a little kind of dreaming about the future, and what each of you want to see in the new economy, and why you are hopeful that what you envision and hope to see may actually come to fruition.
I'll definitely start by saying that we have to start from the vantage of having fiscally sound policy solutions. And I see the drivers of that effort really being our entrepreneurs. The change really needs to be led by those who are most impacted, and the voices of our entrepreneurs and small business owners need to be at the forefront. And quite honestly, in creating an equitable and just and dynamic economy requires that effort to be led by women, by veterans, and by people of color who have been disenfranchised from opportunity, right? And so if they're at the forefront and leading and guiding the development of the policies, by gosh, I hope we're moving more towards equitable, just policy in that regard. I think in addition to that, I'm a fan of Kauffman Foundation's America's Business Plan and its 4 pillars. I think it's a great framework for where to start the conversation. It's a great guidebook, and we here in North Carolina are going to use it to our advantage to be able to educate our policymakers and to create a North Carolina specific plan, right? So we have to think of what's really going to be most applicable here in our very own state. So for me, it's, letting the change be driven by the folks who are most impacted by it, and policymakers being open to that change and willing to deliver upon it.
I feel more optimistic now than I have in a long time. And I think, despite sort of where some of the trend lines are for small business, we are having this conversation about policy in a way that feels, I think, very different to me than even just a few years ago, where there's a recognition that small businesses are not a marginal kind of thing, and that there are ways in which we have set up our policy that are real barriers. And so I think there's a much more substantive conversation. I was thinking at the beginning of the call, and I was reminded of it when you asked for hopeful stories. I live in Maine. I live in Portland, which is sort of the big city, but we're also very much a rural state. And one of the pieces that we did last year, a kind of reported piece about an entrepreneur in Washington County, which is our poorest county and has really some devastating statistics around income, heroin addiction, other things along those lines, and a lot of towns that you go through and that are just really empty. One of the problems that that region has really struggled with is they've been had an absence of pharmacies. They're part of a growing problem of pharmacy deserts that exists in both rural and urban areas. And this pharmacist who had been working for a chain, who was an immigrant from Nigeria, opened a pharmacy because he had so many customers coming from this underserved region and driving 2 and 3 hours to get to his pharmacy, that he saw this need, and he opened this pharmacy. And he's done fairly well. He's now opened a second location in another community in the region. He's had just extraordinary support from the community. But in doing that story, we also talked with him a lot about some of the ways in which the pharmacy benefit management companies, and including CVS Health, kind of make it hard for independent pharmacies to succeed, even though we know that they do a better job in terms of healthcare. They do a better job even in terms of having lower prescription drug prices. And to me, that was a story that was both hopeful, and it also pointed to the work that we need to do, in the sense that if we can change some of these barriers that exist, can you imagine, a bunch of pharmacists who are then able to leave the job at the chain in the big city and actually go into a community that they would love to live in and be a pillar of, and start a business that's really needed. And to me, it's stories like that that I feel like really drive our work.
Yeah, it's a great story. For any entrepreneurs that tune into this conversation, I hope that and expect that they will leave a little bit more hopeful, just knowing that there are organizations like Institute for Local Self-Reliance, the North Carolina Rural Center, who are thinking deeply about these issues and engaging. I love the vision that both of you shared for what we can move into, and just want to echo that. I'm hopeful that we can move into an economy where any American, regardless of their background or where they live, if they want to become an entrepreneur, they have an equal shot, an equal opportunity to do so, to be successful, however they define success for themselves and for their community. I know sometimes we can get frustrated, and there's, I think today, especially a lot to perhaps be frustrated about when it comes to government. But I'm hopeful because, we still live in a country where we each have a voice, and that means we can choose a different path. If we want to see a future that's different than what we have experienced so far, we can engage, we can become advocates, we can share our stories, and lift up those around us in our communities to try and bring about that better future. So thank you both, Brandy, thank you, Stacy, for being part of this conversation today. Thank you for the work that you and your organizations do to help entrepreneurs. And we look forward to working with you and many others to bring about that better economy that we've talked about today. Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.